Hi, my name's Dekan Apajee. I'm a senior lecturer and joint programme leader for sports journalism at the University of East London. Thanks very much for joining me. I hope that you're well and your family are keeping safe. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk to you a little about journalism and COVID-19, just give you a few of my observations. A bit of background about myself. Firstly, I've been with the University of East London for the last four and a half years or so. Prior to that, I was a media producer, producing digital content for organisations and individuals and doing bits of training. And then before that, I was a journalist with the BBC, a broadcast journalist for BBC News. In total, I've got about 18 and a bit years of experience in the industry, in journalism and media. Hopefully what I say is interesting, enlightening. If you've got any questions, then please feel free to email me and I'll do my best to answer them as quickly as I possibly can. Right, so starting COVID-19 and journalism, where do I begin? It's a story that just keeps on giving. It's a story that seems endless because it touches every single aspect of our lives, from healthcare to social care to business to education, society, our view and perceptions of individuals and different people, different classes of people, how we view essential workers, what we believe to be right in terms of minimum wages, our expectations of what we think of society. All of these things are being impacted by COVID-19 in a way that no other story even comes close. I think maybe possibly one of the things that is closest to this, that touches on different elements, is an election. Possibly it touches on these elements of society when people are delivering their manifestos, but nothing that I've worked on or nothing I've seen has touched on all of these aspects of society in such an intense and in-depth way. And as journalists, it's a story that you really get your teeth into. It's a story that just every time you kind of do one element, there's 10 other things that come from that, and 5 other things that come from that. As we saw at the beginning of the stories breaking in about COVID-19, there wasn't much news coming through, but as obviously things have progressed, all of our news is now full of COVID-19 stories. And you might also notice that there's a bit more structure to the news than there was in those initial few weeks, especially made so by the kind of the daily briefings that we're getting from government. So news is kind of factoring that into its production and its delivery. So whenever there's breaking news or comments made by members of the government, that's often then the news that will then now follow through. Whereas before, people were finding stories all over the place, and it was a little bit confusing, and you weren't quite sure what was happening. But I guess those briefings have given news a bit more structure. But how do journalists actually decide what is news? I just wanted to touch on this a little bit. Some of you might know already. But if you don't know, there are news values that journalists use to decide whether a story is newsworthy or not. When you're looking at something like COVID-19, I think it kind of hits all of these news values. But the news values that we look at as journalists when we're deciding whether a story is suitable or not are things like impact. So how many people does this impact? How big is this story? Obviously, COVID-19 is a pandemic. It's affected every single person in the world. There's not one individual, I think, that hasn't been impacted by COVID-19 of some shape or form. It's impacted everybody. It's massive. That's how many people live in the world. That's how many people it's impacted. We're also looking at timeliness. So is this a new story? Is this something that's we haven't seen before? And yes, it is. It's something that's new. It's just come on the scene, and it's something that we've had to kind of adapt to very, very quickly. It's something that's also constantly changing every day. They're finding new information out about the virus itself and how it impacts not only the body, but how it's impacting the rest of our world, as it were. Another news value that we look at is proximity. So how close are our audience to the story? And is it relevant? And therefore, is it relevant to our audience? And initially, it might be argued actually because everything was happening in China, it wasn't relevant to the UK audience, so it didn't get that much coverage. But as the virus has kind of slowly moved into mainland Europe, into Italy, to Spain, to France, and into the UK, it became more and more prominent in our news. So proximity was something that really kind of made this story, or kind of really helped generate the amount of news that's coming across from this story. The other thing that we look at is things like prominence, so individuals and organisations that are involved in the story. And obviously this has touched some massive organisations and across the board. Again, we're looking at the health system, we're looking at government, we're looking at sports organisations, sporting bodies. I mean, we've shut down the Olympics and Paralympics, or postponed the Olympics and Paralympics, and Wimbledon's been cancelled. There's all of these big organisations and big things that are happening that have been hit and impacted by the virus and by the pandemic. And as journalists, you're looking at news stories and think, actually, does this story have these news values to it? And the COVID-19 story, coronavirus story, has literally ticked every single news value box that you can think of, and it's something that I hate to use it, but it is unprecedented in that sense. Another news value that journalists look at, and one that seems to make up most of the news that we'll read at any point in time, is conflict. And this story, although it didn't have much conflict to start with, it's developed conflict. This story has developed conflict. If we look at the stories around government response, the supply of PPE equipment for NHS and frontline workers, when we're looking at kind of people's reactions to the lockdown initially, we're then now looking at kind of people's reactions to kind of what's happening with business and how employees are being impacted, and how businesses are being impacted by the various schemes that the government has implemented, and whether that's the right thing or the wrong way to go, etc. So this conflict that's seeping into the news now, and again, it makes up usually the biggest thing, or usually the number one thing that makes a news story is some element of conflict, whether that's argument or actual conflict. So these are things that journalists constantly look for, and COVID-19 has all of this in abundance, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. Something else that I've seen over the last few months or so is a massive increase in the use of digital. Obviously, we're all using digital. I'm talking to you online at the moment, but we've seen it within journalism. It's really kind of been something that has had to be embraced, and COVID-19 has been a catalyst for that. We did see journalism using digital, and they've been doing it for a very long time. Ever since I started in the BBC almost 20 years ago, digital was a buzzword that was kind of floated around at every opportunity. But now we're seeing more innovation in terms of how people are producing content to get news across, in terms of doing down the lines. We're seeing in terms of how we're seeing studio structure. If you're watching things like Question Time, you can see how people are spacing themselves out. All of these things and kind of a change in the way we're working. And for organisations and media outlets and journalism outlets that hadn't embraced or hadn't really thought about their digital strategy or started doing a digital transformation, they are feeling the pinch at the moment, because it's that ability to maintain communication, to maintain connection with your audience, that is kind of keeping journalists going, in the sense that they know that they can communicate and they can produce content and they can get it across to the members of the public that want to hear and listen to it. What I would say, the flip side of kind of the fact that journalism is using more digital, is that some elements of the world of journalism, especially when you come talking about print news and newspapers, etc., are again suffering because of the fact that we've got all of these guidelines in place. We've got social distancing. Lots of the outlets where newspapers would be sold, like newsagents, have had to close, or people are not wanting to go into necessarily smaller shops because of fears around social distancing and the inability to social distance in those kind of environments. So newspapers have seen a significant a drop in sales recently. And again, if things like this virus and lockdown continue as it is, we'll probably see in maybe 6 months' time some newspapers actually fold because of this, and no pun intended. So it's interesting the way that, in one hand, actually digital is kind of really bringing in new audiences and helping us tell stories and helping us be creative in helping us tell stories, but also it's having a massive detrimental impact on some elements of news telling and journalism. With the rise of digital, we've seen this already over the years when it comes to many stories, especially around elections, etc. Is an increase in fake news and the increase in stories that are being told that have misinformation or are being miscommunicated. And as journalists, it's really important that we take responsibility for the information that we put out there, and we are really held to account on that, in all honesty. I think most journalists adhere to the rule that you should check and check again, and make sure that your source material is completely reliable. Because as a journalist, the number one thing you have to rely on is trust. If you don't have trust with your audience, then they're not going to keep coming back to you. They're going to kind of go somewhere else with information if they don't believe what you're telling them is true or is accurate. So it's really important as journalists that you maintain that trust. So you have to check your content over and over again. And I'd encourage members of the public as well to check the content that you're reading and that you're deciding to forward on to other individuals or repost, because it's really important that you're not part of the issue in terms of the spread of fake news. I'm not saying that you have to go and sit down with a magnifying glass and do week-long research into different stories that you see coming out, but it's important you just do the basic checks. So if you see something posted and you're not quite sure about it, just do a quick search on a search engine and see, actually, are other people saying this? Is this something else? Are there any legitimate news sources that have kind of mentioned this story, or individuals or journalists that have kind of spoken about this as well, that I can verify against, I can match this up against? Also check who's actually saying it. Is the individual, who are they? What have they said before? You can click on their name and their profile will often come up, and you can see what they've said before. You can see who their followers are. If you're this way inclined, you could actually do a search to see whether or not they have fake followers, whether it's a real account. There's various bits of software online that you can kind of type in someone's name or type in someone's handle and find out whether or not the 33,000 followers that they say they have are all real people or robots. And then that can help you decide actually whether that information has value to it, whether it is trustworthy. I think that's really important for us as members of the public, not just for journalists to do. Where I see this going and how I see this type of thing playing out, I would like to see, and I think it's happening more and more, and we're seeing it in the news, that because this is impacting so many different people across so many different levels of society, that there's a sense of accountability that is coming into journalism, and journalists are starting to hold government and the officials to account in terms of how they're responding and how they're supporting all walks of life across our society. And I think that's really important. I hope that's something that continues on through this, because as I said, there's no other story that has impacted so many people, so many different types of people, and it would be a shame if after this nothing changed. And I think what journalists have responsibilities to do right now is to kind of highlight all of those areas, all of those inequalities that are dotted throughout our society that have kind of led us to this position, that have made us question why it is that a key worker who works 50, 60 hours a week still can't afford food for their families, etc., or can't get into public transport, or can't do certain things. And I think this whole situation should really make us look at it. And I think it's important for journalists to kind of find these stories, and they are finding these stories, and really kind of keep telling these stories. I also think it's important that we don't forget the other news that is kind of out there at the moment. We've got lots of things kind of bubbling over prior to the COVID-19 stuff, like our departure from the EU, etc., and how all that's going to be impacted. And as time goes on, hopefully those stories will start to come back through, and we'll kind of see again government officials being held to accountability with regards to those subjects and those subject areas. That's what I wanted to say really, just kind of give you a bit of an overview of what I think about what's going on and how journalists and journalism is covering COVID-19. If you have any questions, then please feel free to email me. I'll happily try and answer any questions that you might have. Other than that, I hope you stay safe and well, and take care of yourselves.